All right. Sorry for the wait there. So last time I talked about the structure of reason relations without talking about logic, just relations of consequence and incompatibility that hold among non-logical concepts. Pittsburgh is to the east of New York, so New York is to the west of Pittsburgh. The coin being made of copper is incompatible with its being an electrical insulator. And not talking logic here, but there are reason relations. On that basis, I could give as a reason for thinking that New York is to the west, is to the east of Pittsburgh, that Pittsburgh is to the west of New York, and I can give as a reason against thinking the coin is made of copper, that it's an electrical insulator. And we saw that there's at least prima facie reason to believe that the strong structural conditions that hold for logical reason relations don't hold in general, and found relaxation of monotonicity is something that logicians have worried about a lot. We suggested, well, they should worry about that for incompatibility as well as for implication. Lately, transitivity has been coming in for more interest, typically in connection with the semantic paradoxes. We see monotonicity and at least strong forms of transitivity as much more intimately tied together than people seem to realize. I gave the Simonelli examples or recipe for how to turn non-monotonicity examples into non-transitivity models. We'll see in a couple minutes. Wolf has an argument that if you put our minimal expressivist conditions on conditionals, that in the context of the conditional, the principle we call containment, under those circumstances, transitivity entails monotonicity. So that's going in the other direction from the Simonelli result. But we suggested that there's another kind of closure, explicitation closure. And this, I think, is an important topic that's a new topic. The question of what happens when you move something from the right side of an implication turnstile to the left side. You take something that is implied by your premise sets and embrace it as an explicit premise. The assumption has been that though monotonicity might not hold, at least cautious monotonicity does, so that those adding some new premise might infirm an implication, that doesn't happen if the premise that you have added is already implied by the other premises. That would mean that explicitation does not lose any implicit content. CT, cumulative transitivity, says that explicitation doesn't add any. So between them, those conditions entail that explicitation is inconsequential. It never makes any difference to what's implied by a premise set if you add to it things that are also implied by it. And I pointed out that that condition is presupposed by our talk about rational closure, closing our beliefs under reason relations, and that there are interesting things that happen, hysteresis, path dependence of the development of your beliefs, the rational development, developing your beliefs by acknowledging the rational consequences of them. And I think one of the overall lessons I'd like to draw from that discussion is there's a lot of structural issues about reason relations that come up even before we're talking about logic. And one might like a formal vocabulary, a mathematized vocabulary, that would give you a technical grip on those structural issues. And we're going to find that we can reverse engineer sequent calculi used to codify logical reason relations, we can use them in order to talk about those pre-logical relations. Still, the tradition tells us that the meta-vocabulary you use to talk about reason relations is logical vocabulary. So far, logic hasn't come up. And so the question arises, well, we've been talking about reason relations. We understand them in two different ways. Pragmatically, in terms of the norms governing giving and asking for reasons, implications codifying reasons for acceptance, and incompatibilities codifying reasons against acceptance. And we saw we could understand these same relations in truth-maker terms, all of that without talking about logic. So where does logic come into the story? And here I want to contrast two different views you might have, two different stances you might take toward the question, what is the relation between logic and reasons? And there, I think, has always been a philosophical tradition, well, always, since Aristotle gave us logic, that thought, well, logic really is the science of reasons. It's a way to tell by calculating what's a reason for and what's a reason against. Now, this was by no means always everybody's view. During medieval times and early modern, there were people who thought about it differently, but this was a view that was abroad. But it really got serious around 1900. We had Frege introducing logical vocabulary to codify the reason relations of arithmetic. And Russell, in his paradigmatic for analytic philosophy essay on denoting, showed how you could understand inferences involving definite descriptions in terms of basically Fregean logical relations underneath them. And this spawned, Russell was an ideologist of the rising tide of analytic philosophy, and he propagandized for a program that sought to find underneath any reason relations of implication or incompatibility, relations of logical consequence and logical inconsistency. One was supposed to exhibit the reason relations of any target vocabulary as ultimately the result of the sentences of that vocabulary corresponding to logically complex sentences, and the reason relations among them holding in virtue of the purely logical reason relations that held among those logically complex sentences. Now, that program's more than a century old, and I think it's fair to say it suffered a number of disappointments. Even within mathematics, it looked as though logic would only take us so far, and the number of other substantive fields of reason relations that have been codified in purely logical terms is not large. But if logicism about reasons isn't the right view, if the generalization that seems so tempting from Frege being able to codify relations of arithmetic, I'm bracketing the small question of the inconsistency of his system here, and Russell showing how various non-mathematical reason relations could be logically analyzed. If that was a misleading example, because it would only take us so far, is there anything more to be said about logic than that sometimes you can codify some reason relations with it? Would not be an exciting view. But there is another view. It's not simply the denial of logicism, but it's something like the converse of it, that says, no, material reason relations are what they are. They come first, and we introduce logic later on, not to prove that one thing is a reason for another by logical means, but because logical vocabulary gives us the expressive power to say what's a reason for what and what's a reason against what. And if we look at Frege's own view in the 1879 Begriffsschrift, he says that's what he's doing, that he's introduced his Begriffsschrift, concept script, literally, as a way of codifying, of expressing explicitly the reason relations that, in virtue of which concepts mean what they mean. So he says, I want to codify conceptual content, begriffliche Inhalt, and he says, and that's a matter of what follows from what. So, just now paraphrasing the third paragraph of the Begriffsschrift, if you have two propositions, it may or may not be that when you combine them with the same collateral hypotheses, they have the same consequences. If it's guaranteed that they do, then they have the same conceptual content. And it's conceptual content in that sense that my, Frege's, Begriffsschrift aims to make explicit. And in an essay that he wrote and published around the same time the Begriffsschrift came out about that project, he says, though I only look to arithmetic concepts in the Begriffsschrift, I take it that it would be easy to extend this to rational mechanics. Well, first to geometry and then to rational mechanics. He says you would just need to add some special primitive symbols for some of the non-logical relations that hold there. So this is a different view, a view about logic in terms of what it can express. And it's this logical expressivist project that we're pursuing in the book. Indeed, having convinced ourselves philosophically of the fruitfulness of this way of thinking about logic in the philosophy of logic, and I'll say something about that in a minute, the question we confronted more than a decade ago is, well, if that's what logic is, and you'd started off with that conception, how would you do logic differently than we in fact have done it? And the particular challenge that the observations from last week set for us are, well, logical reason relations are topologically closed. And that's a problem for logicism, obviously, if material reason relations aren't generally monotonic and transitive. How are you going to construct them out of things that are monotonic and transitive? And that's pretty much the way the field of non-monotonic logic sees its task. Okay, we know how ordinary non-funny logic works, monotonic and transitive logic works. Can we exploit that capacity to reconstruct non-monotonic reason relations? And yes, we can add some structure, preference orderings, or various things. We can restrict the number of models that we allow. in order to turn monotonic logics into non-monotonic logics. But the substructurality, the open structured character of material reason relations causes every bit as much of a problem for the expressivist. How are you going to use a vocabulary, logical vocabulary, that is monotonic and transitive? How are you going to use that to express reason relations that aren't? So one way or another, there's a challenge set by acknowledging the possibility, the reality, the actuality of open structured reason relations. But on the expressivist view, this is crucially important. If you don't have logical vocabulary, the expressivist picture is you can still make claims, you can still offer challenges that consist of giving reasons against them, you can offer defenses that consist of giving reasons for them, and keep track of how the entitlements holistically move around on the basis of that. So you can be critical about which doxastic commitments you accept or reject. But the reason relations are just the rules of that game. They're not in the game as something that you can challenge or rationally change. They're just governing what's going on. Now, if you can introduce claims that say that one thing is a reason for another or a reason against, if you can put those in the form of claims, that's making it explicit, making it something you can say, that is, that you can assert or deny, then challenging those, defending those, will be bringing into the game of giving and asking for reasons the reasons that are governing that. You'll be able to be critical not just about which contents you accept, but about which the concepts really are, what the reason relations among them are. So there's two sorts of critical capacity we'd like to have. We'd like to be critical about our doxastic commitments, but also about our broadly inferential commitments. Broadly because I mean implications and incompatibilities. And why is that? Well, our founding hero Socrates tells us. Often you have inferences curled up in your concepts that you're unaware of, and when you're confronted with the incompatibilities among things that by your lights ought to be compatible, you need to unpack and say, oh, I see, does it follow from its being a pious act that it's loved by the gods, or does that run the other way? That Socratic enterprise of being critical about the reasons that we accept requires being able to make these explicit. So logic, as construed by a logical expressivist, has some claim to be the vocabulary of rational self-consciousness. It lets you become explicitly aware, in the sense of explicit awareness, involves being able to make claims with that content. What follows from what and what's incompatible with what. And if, as Frege seems to have been, at least about mathematics, you're also a semantic inferentialist, that is, you think there is at least a crucial dimension of the content of linguistic expressions, the content expressed by declarative sentences, that's articulated precisely by the reason relations that it stands in. You needn't say that's all there is to content, but you say this semantic meta-vocabulary of reason relations is characterizing a genuine notion of content. insofar as that's right, logic is also at least an organ of semantic self-consciousness, of your being able to make explicit the relations in virtue of which your words mean what they mean. Now, can we turn the crank one more time on that and become critical about the content of the logical vocabulary in terms of being critical about the reason relations that conditionals and negations stand in? Well, yes, we can do that too. Not yet, but we'll get to that. So there's an attractive, I think, picture. I should point out that it is not uncontroversial. My esteemed and beloved colleague John McDowell rejects this layer cake picture. On this layer cake picture, it's at least intelligible that there should be creatures that are sapient, that are discursive creatures, by which I just mean they can engage in an autonomous discursive practice, a language game they could play though they played no other, that consisted of making claims, expressing acceptance and rejection, and challenging entitlement and defending entitlement to that with more claims, so they could actually say that things are thus and so, even though they were not yet able to be critical about the reason relations that normatively governed that activity, and only later on came to be able to be critical about the moves they made as opposed to the positions they were occupying. And McDowell says, no, to be a discursive creature, you have to be able to be rationally critical about every aspect of your practice. Reason can't be limited in the way that the expressivist picture, it's not. We're not committed to there having actually been this historical hominins who just didn't have logic yet. But we are committed to its being intelligible that there should be. That is an autonomous discursive practice that when we described in a normative pragmatic meta-vocabulary. McDowell's view is, in one of his favorite Wittgensteinian phrases, the light dawns slowly over the whole. So you have to come into an up and running practice that involves all the logical vocabulary, everything you need to be rationally and semantically self-conscious, and you just get slightly better at making the right moves and avoiding the bad moves with all of it at the same time. So I just registered that that's certainly an intelligible pushback. Why not think about it that way? And actually that way is compatible with a weaker expressivist understanding of what the logic is doing in here. Now I said I thought this was an attractive view in the philosophy of logic. A whole generation's concerns in the philosophy of logic was set by a little book Quine wrote in the middle of the 60s called The Philosophy of Logic, that was immediately responded to by his colleague Hilary Putnam with another slim book also called The Philosophy of Logic. So just take these two. And what they agreed about was the two big questions were the demarcation question and the correctness question. The demarcation question, what do you mean by logic? What makes something a logical concept or claim? What makes something a bit of logical vocabulary? It matters a lot if you're inclined to try and make Frege's original Logicism about mathematics project work. It makes a big difference whether the set theoretic epsilon is a bit of logical vocabulary. If it is, you can use all the set theory to get your mathematics. But if it's not, why not? What makes the universal quantifier logical and the set theoretic epsilon mathematical but not logical? So there's a demarcation question. And this was particularly urgent for Quine, who had, anyway, one of his views, I'll bracket the question of how compatible this is with various of his other views, was, as the expressivist thinks, you should start with material reason relations, start with a lexicon of sentences and reason relations among sets of them, and then pick out the logical vocabulary according to your demarcation question, and now ask which implications that are good implications remain good under arbitrary substitution of non-logical for non-logical vocabulary. And in that way you'll find out that implications like if it's raining, then the streets will be wet, it's raining, so the streets will be wet, is an instance of a pattern, because all the instances of that that have the same form that you can get to from that by substituting non-logical for non-logical vocabulary are good. So he says to say something is a logically good consequence just is to say it's a materially good consequence. That's Seller's term, not his, but he says just to say it's a good consequence, and you can't turn it into a bad consequence by substituting non-logical for non-logical vocabulary. Now I want to point out that's that move of Quine's is already an instance of a kind. I can say that something is good in virtue of its theological form if it's a good inference and you can't turn it into a bad inference by substituting non-theological for non-theological vocabulary. That is, that method of noting invariance under substitution is a notion of form, not a notion of logical form. To get a notion of logical form, you need to have picked out the vocabulary that you're going to hold fixed as logical vocabulary. But if you do, if you get that demarcational, if you answer that demarcational question, and you know what are the good implications and incompatibilities in the field you're talking about, then you can derive what the logically good ones are from that. Second question, the correctness question, yeah, and what's the right logic? Is it intuitionism? Is it classical logic? Is it quantum logic? Is it some modal logic? What's the correct logic, and why? What do you mean by correct logic? Those were the two questions. If you asked contemporary philosophers of logic, neither of those questions is front and center for them. You'll get questions about adoption problems and anti-exceptionalism, and so on, a different agenda. At any rate, logical expressivism offers an answer to the demarcation question. It says, to be a bit of logical vocabulary is to play a particular expressive role. You have a particular expressive task, and that is to make reason relations explicit. So in our sort of regimentation, the paradigm is making implications explicit and making incompatibilities explicit. And the claim is going to be the paradigmatic bits of logical vocabulary are conditionals and negation, because that's what they do. But right at the beginning, it's important to see, if you give that kind of answer to the demarcation question, you're rejecting the correctness question. Because expressing reason relations is something you could do in more than one way. In particular, if I say, I want to be able to say explicitly that something is a good implication. When I say if P then Q, that's going to mean that the implication from P to Q is a good one, which doesn't mean that if you have good reasons for P, you're obliged to acknowledge Q. You can exploit those implication relations in different ways. But if the question is, what is it to express the goodness of an implication? Well, there are as many correct answers to that as there are senses of good implication. So if we think about the poor, much maligned, two-valued horseshoe, which people say, well, that doesn't codify any sense of reason for if every false claim stands in that relation to every other false claim, that's not a reason. Well, don't you agree that it's a bad thing about an implication if it has true premises and a false conclusion? Yeah, that's bad. Well, it's the corresponding sense of good, being good at least in that it isn't bad in that way. That's what's codified by the dog-ass two-valued conditional. It's at least good in that what you're claiming is it's good in that it does not have true premises and a false conclusion. Now that's a pretty weak sense of good, but it's a place to start. Does that mean that's the correct logic? Well, you might, anytime you care about that sense of good logic, help yourself to that conditional. It's doing its job. Another sense of good implication is it's a good implication if there's a recipe for turning a proof of the premises into a proof of the conclusion. Or more generally, a decisively good argument, good reason for the premises into decisively good reasons for the conclusion. That's the sense of if then that the intuitionist conditional codifies. And again, that's a good making property of implication. So insofar as that actually is captured by the intuitionistic arrow, which it is, then that's a good logic too. Oh, but don't classical logic of the two-valued conditional and intuitionism, don't they collide with one another? Well, not if you think about their conditionals as saying different things. They don't. Let 100 flowers blossom is the irenic pluralistic counsel of logical expressivism. Again, isn't it a good thing about an implication if it's impossible that the premises be true and the conclusion not be true? Yes, that's a good feature of them. Maybe you don't want to insist on that for all of the reason relations, but that's a good making feature of an implication. That's the one that's codified by C.I. Lewis's hook of strict implication. All right, so for a fourth one, if the vocabulary we're using is that of quantum mechanics, and so propositions are represented by subspaces of the phase space, that is ranges that the different dynamical variables can take, well then implication can be understood in terms of one subspace being included in another, being a subspace of another. Wouldn't it be good if, isn't it a good feature of implications among statements in the vocabulary of quantum mechanics if the space of the subspace of the phase space, that is the intersection of the phase space subspaces of all the premises, is itself a subspace of the space for the conclusions? Well, yes, it is. Then that will underwrite your reasoning in quantum mechanics. Well, you get quantum logic as having the conditional that codifies that inclusion relation among subspaces in Hilbert space. If it were in Euclidean space, you just get it's a Boolean algebra and you just get classical logic. So the point is, if you give the expressivist answer to the demarcation question, the question of correctness lapses. You don't any longer ask what's the right logic. You ask about some proposed logic. What sense of good implication or incompatibility does it codify? Is there a coherent one? Is it an important one? And basically, all the well enough behaved logics do. But to understand them, the expressivist says, understand what it codifies. Now, we can make the demands of the expressivist more precise. And this I do early in my Locke lectures, the between saying and doing. I say, what we want is to be able to take a field of sentences that stand in reason relations, what I'm now calling a vocabulary. We want to take that vocabulary and elaborate from it a new vocabulary, which consists of those same sentences, the sentences in the non-logical base vocabulary, and all the logically complex sentences you can build out of them by saying, well, if any of the two sentences of the new one, if these are two sentences of the expanded language, then their conjunction is also one. So is their disjunction. So is the negation of each of them. So is the conditional relating them. We want to be able to elaborate the reason relations that hold among the logically complex sentences formed from our base, from the reason relations of the base, in just the same way as it were semantically that I just described how to do syntactically. Right? Syntactically, I said how to define the sentences of the logically extended language from the other, from the sentences of the base vocabulary. We want to be able to define the reason relations that hold among the logically complex sentences from the reason relations that hold among the base sentences. That's to say that the logically extended vocabulary should be elaborated from the base vocabulary. You should be able to compute its lexicon from the lexicon of the base. And as I say, you do that very easily. You say, well, everything in the base lexicon is in the extended lexicon, and if any two sentences are in the extended lexicon, then so is the conditional relating them, and so on for each of the connectives. We also, so that's sort of on the syntactic lexical side, and we also want to be able to compute the reason relations, the implications and incompatibilities of the logic of all the sets of logically complex sentences that can be formed from that base. We want to be able to compute that from the reason relations of the base. And that's a non-trivial task. But also, because we're expressivists about logical vocabulary, when we've done that, we want to be able to tell that the logical vocabulary explicates, makes explicit the reason relations, well, of the base, but now also of the extended language. So we want it to be the logical extension to be elaborated from and explicative of the reason relations of the base. So I call it LX, elaborated and explicative of. Yeah.
I'm wondering how we should understand, talk about non-logical vocabulary in the definition of LX. And the reason why I'm asking is, okay, so if we want to answer this demarcation question, and we want to say what counts as logical, non-logical vocabulary, the answer is that the stuff that's going to count as logical has to be LX. So, and the definition of LX involves talking about non-logical vocabulary. So it would seem that we would have to know what the non-logical vocabulary, we'd have to know what the logical vocabulary is in order to see, whether it counts as logical. And that's not going to be good.
Okay,
so
John.
Do we do we talk about non-logical vocabulary like this? Here's a test for whether a vocabulary is logical. You take that vocabulary out of your language to form a base vocabulary which doesn't contain the vocabulary that's in question. Then you see whether it satisfies these conditions for LFs.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
I mean, this is a good question because I was, you were noticing I was running back and forth really between an analytic and a synthetic use of this machinery. So the Quinean picture is an analytic one. He's imagining you start with the language that includes the logically, he's giving us an analytic account. We start with the logically extended vocabulary, pick out, however, the logical vocabulary in it, and then hold that fixed and look at all the substitutions and see whether those are good to get logically good. I'm thinking now about starting with a language that doesn't have any logical vocabulary in it. It's just a base vocabulary. It could be that base vocabulary has some other logical vocabulary in it. Maybe it has intuitionistic logical vocabulary in it, but it doesn't have whatever I'm introducing now. And I'm going to give rules that show how to compute the reason relations of the new sentences from the reason relations of the old one. So non-logical can just mean whatever you start with. If you're thinking of that as not containing the logic that you're introducing. So if we put this notion of explicitation, I think elaboration is pretty easy to understand. Explicitation, not so much. There's elaboration we can understand just in terms of computing the one lexicon from the other, computing the reason relations from the other. We can say a condition on doing that is that it be inferentially conservative, that is, that it not introduce any new implications or incompatibilities that hold only among the old vocabulary, only among the base vocabulary. And we learned this when Pryor criticized Genson's way of introducing logical connectives, saying, if you introduce a connective tonk by saying, tonk is like conjunction, is like disjunction in its introduction rules. So you can go from A to A tonk B, the way you can go from A to A or B. Those are all good implications. And tonk is, in its elimination rule, it's like conjunction. You can go from A tonk B to A, and you can go from A tonk B to B. So we can state those two rules, but the effect of adding tonk to any base vocabulary is what Pryor calls a runabout inference ticket that will take you from A to A tonk B and from A tonk B to B, so you can go from any arbitrary A to any arbitrary B, and that tonks up your system. It trivializes the reason relations. And Belknap responded on behalf of the proof theorists, saying, well, the condition is, a necessary and sufficient condition for ruling out tonk-like connectives is that we require them to be inferentially conservative, that they not add any new implications that hold exclusively among old vocabulary. Now, he just said that as a technical matter. Look, this will fix that. Let's just throw this in. But if you're an expressivist, you say, look, if the point is to let you argue about the reason relations in the base, then you don't want to do something that's changing them. That's precisely not making them explicit. So for sure, you want to preserve the reason relations that hold exclusively among the old vocabulary, even though you're going to be connecting those old sentences to the new sentences, the logically complex ones. And this way of thinking about things, if we start off with the two flavors of reason relation, implication and incompatibility, I think they basically determine what the expressive role of conditionals and negation is. And this is on the first page of your handout. For the conditional, a double deduction theorem, double Ramsey condition, it says some set of premises should imply a conditional just in case that same context together with the antecedent implies the conclusion. Ramsey suggested this as a condition for introducing conditionals. And from an expressivist point of view, we want to say, look, this is just what it is for the conditional to say that A implies B. You're committed to accept the conditional just in case, were you to accept the antecedent, you'd be committed to accept the conclusion. And similarly, the incoherence incompatibility condition on negation, gamma implies not A, just in case A's incompatible with gamma. Now, sometimes when I was writing reason relations, I was using the pound sign for incompatibility. In proof theory generally, we use a trick and codify incompatibilities by putting an empty right-hand side and treating everything on the left-hand side as an incoherent set. That builds in the symmetry of incompatibility, but we've seen that's built in anyway. That lets us use one symbol, the turnstile, to codify both reason relations. I've complained that people forget about incompatibility as an independent reason relation because of this notational convenience that we use. So I want to strenuously guard against that deleterious consequence, but it is a tremendous notational convenience, and we'll continue to use it. So from a inferential expressivist, a logical expressivist point of view, this is the minimal sufficient condition on being a conditional or negation, that you can say that an implication is good in this sense, or say that A is incompatible with gamma by having gamma imply not A. We're going to see those are really tough conditions to satisfy. They're particularly tough. They're tough conditions to satisfy. Well, for instance, the conditional of Graham Priest's logic of paradox, the trilogic LP that I'll talk about at the end, its conditional doesn't satisfy this. You can't detach from conditionals in the logic of paradox. We expressivists just say, well, it's not an expressively powerful logic. It does not have a conditional that can express implication in it. But it's not that, it's not for no reason that this fails. And in a minute, when I talk about sequent calculi, I'll say sort of what the trouble. The trouble is that these are biconditionals. But there's another one, another trouble. This is a argument due to Hlobil. So suppose we start. So that's an assumption that gamma implies A, and gamma together with A and B implies A. That's true by CO. What's a premise is a conclusion. Then now we can get gamma together with A implies B arrow A. You just move the B across in the conditional according to the DD principle. That told us that a conditional is implied, B arrow A, just in a context, just in case. In that context, if you add the antecedent, you get the conclusion. So we get to gamma together with A implies B arrow A. But now we started off as an assumption that gamma implies A, so we can cut on A if we have transitivity and get gamma implies B arrow A, and that means that gamma together with B implies A. That's just the other direction of exploiting the Ramsey consequence. And now we've gone from gamma implies A to gamma with an arbitrary B implies A, and that's just monotonicity. So this is an argument, a proof, that in the context of CO, cut implies monotonicity if you've got a conditional that satisfies the DD principle. So this is a serious constraint on doing logic in non-monotonic and non-transitive environments. So, as I say, we'll see another problem with these principles in just a minute. But the more precise and determinate way of putting the logical expressivist project, then, is to say, we'd like to find some one logic that is universally LX. That is, that no matter what structural principles hold of a base vocabulary that you're given, that when you apply this logic to it, you will be able to say what those reason relations are in the base vocabulary. And that universal LXness is challenging. Okay. But after 10 years, we did it. Really, Dan Kaplan and Ulf Hlobil did it. And furthermore, the logic that you get is a familiar one. Indeed, if you take our logic, and that's the one NMMS for non-monotonic multi-succedent logic. That's the one in the middle of page 2 on your handout. If you impose monotonicity, containment, and cut on it, it's just a formulation of classical logic. It just is classical logic. But you can apply it to reason relations that are non-monotonic, non-transitive, indeed are hyper non-monotonic in failing even cautious monotonicity, and keep full control over it. You'll get a supraclassical logic, and here's a consequence of what I've just said that may not be obvious immediately. This logic, NMMS, must be elaboratable from any arbitrary base vocabulary, so non-monotonic, non-transitive, and so on, base vocabularies. It must do that conservatively. That is, it must have those non-monotonic implications still holding in the logical extension of it. So, the implication and incompatibility relations of the logically extended language cannot be monotonic or transitive. Once it's applied to some base set that isn't, those implications stay there, and it's still just not the case. If it was the case that gamma implies A, but gamma together with B did not imply A, that's still going to be the case. Conservatism means that there's no route through logical consequences that can bring you back to establish this new relation and say, oh, no, now in the logically extended one, gamma together with B does imply A. That would be non-conservative, and our rules are not. Our rules are conservative, which means that in general, the reason relations of the logically extended language are as substructural as the reason relations to which they're applied. But if you look at the reason relations that hold in virtue of logic alone, those are just the reason relations of classical logic. Now, what do I mean by holding just in virtue of logic alone? Well, you could just apply now the Quinean criterion to this logically extended language. Look at all the reason relations, sort of pick one, fix the logical vocabulary in it, and look at all the variants. And if you started with a good one and all the variants are good, if substitution of non-logical for non-logical vocabulary happens salva consequentia, saving the goodness of consequences, then it's a logically good implication or incompatibility. It turns out, you can prove, that that's equivalent to saying what holds in virtue of logic alone is what holds no matter what base vocabulary you apply the rules to. The purely logical reason relations are the ones that are common to all of the extensions. So you have to distinguish between the reason relations of the logically extended vocabulary, which are radically open structured, and the purely logical reason relations, which in that sense, the logic we have is a monotonic logic and a transitive logic. It's structurally classical. But it turns out it can codify non-monotonic, non-transitive reason relations in the sense that it lets you say what those are. But it's important to keep separate sets of books on the reason relations of the whole extended vocabulary and the purely logical reason relations. Now so all of that was a bunch of claims about how wonderful NMMS is. I want to sort of back away and say something about sort of what kind of a thing it is. One of Ulf's first innovations was to see that if we were going to move from logical expressivism in the philosophy of logic to develop expressivist logics that did the expressivist job better than extant logics do, that the right meta-vocabulary for us to work in is a sequent calculus meta-vocabulary. We've been working mostly in model theoretic things, partly because of the training of the people who were in the group. And we came to a new appreciation of Genson's achievement in coming up with the sequent calculus. So his brilliant idea was to treat reason relations as the objects of a mathematical structure. So you've got a lexicon of sentences, and we're looking at pairs of sets, ordered pairs of sets of sentences that we're going to put the turnstile between to make into a sequent. Sequent means what follows, and so we're going to have a privileged set of these pairs of sets of lexical items, which are the good ones, the sequence that hold. Well, yeah, and we have two different things we know to mean by that. Holding, we could understand in pragmatic terms. That means that being committed to accept all the premises and committed to reject all the conclusions is out of bounds. Or it can mean the fusion of any truth maker of all of the premises with any false maker of all of the conclusions is always an impossible state. Those are two things, two senses of good implication. But take what you will. What the sequent calculus does is say, let me give you a meta-inferential consequence relation that says that if all the sequents above the line are good, or have whatever distinguished property we give them, we put an asterisk on some of the sequence. If everything above the line gets an asterisk, then so does everything below the line. That's a consequence relation. It's in principle a transitive. It's built into it that it's transitive. But his idea was, I'm going to introduce new sentences, the ones formed with logical vocabulary, and specify their reason relations by the meta-inferential moves that you can make from sequence that include those new sentences to other sequence that include them. So if you look at the Genson system, this is LK, his system for classical logic. Say the L rule for negation. If the sequent gamma implies delta and A is a good one, then so is gamma together with not A implies delta. And Genson, so he has a set of meta-inferential principles, And this is going to be the way he computes the reason relations on the logically extended vocabulary from the reason relations, the sequence that apply, that only use sentences of the base lexicon. So the sequent calculus is an engine for computing the reason relations of the sentences of a logically extended language from the reason relations of the base vocabulary. Now, that's using a different vocabulary for talking about the sequent calculus than is usually used. Almost always, when you do sequent calculi, and this is what Gensen did in his original papers, you're doing it to get a purely logical result. And so, what do you start off with as your good ones? Only sequence whose goodness is structurally guaranteed. Guaranteed by, well, reflexivity, that A implies A. What I've called containment is contexted reflexivity. It says, yeah, and A implies A, sort of no matter what gamma you throw in with it on the premise side and what delta you throw in with it on the conclusory side. In a proper Gensen proof tree, the leaves that you start with are just instances of A implies A. And what you get then is what holds in virtue of pure logic. But Gensen was perfectly aware that you could start with other sets of good implications. You could get your leaves elsewhere. You could be elaborating an inferential theory, a set of good sequence, because in his other big achievement was proving the consistency and completeness of arithmetic. Proving the consistency of arithmetic. You want to say, well, now, I thought you couldn't do that. He took the axioms of piano arithmetic as the leaves and used a particularly strong induction principle. He helped himself to omega induction, which Gödel had not had ruled out as too strong. But anyway, Gensen did elaborate this theory, so he knew that you could do that. So it's important to. It took us a long time to see this, but Wolf finally did. That sequent calculus is just what the expressivist was looking for, a way of computing the reason relations of a logically extended language from the reason relations of a base one. And it does so in a clever way that's crucial for Gensen to be able to prove the meta-theoretic results that he wanted to about logics. And that is that in Gensen's proper system, the sequence below the line always have more logical connectives in them than the sequence above the line. They're always complicating moves. So you know, if you start from a leaf which only has atomic sentences in it, and you can derive from that by the rules some sequent, then you know that there's an upper limit to how many steps can have been taken, because you know every step added some, increased the maximum complexity of the sentences that occurred below the line. And that means that you can prove things inductively by sort of stripping off the last step, and you know that everything smaller and you know that it's only a finite number of steps that will get you to a leaf. So all of your proofs are inductions either on the length of the formula, that is the complexity of the formula, or the length of the proof. But, and this is something that literally cost us years thinking about. DD, our principle for conditionals, and II, the conditional for negation, they're biconditionals. They go both ways. How are you going to get the version of DD that says you can go if gamma implies A arrow B is a good sequent, then gamma together with A implies B is a good sequent? That's a simplifying move, and you're not allowed to make those in the Gensen system, or we lose all the meta-theoretic sort of control over things. And here's the answer. The question is what that biconditional means. If it means if it means you can derive gamma turnstile A arrow B from gamma A turnstile B, and vice versa, that's not true. You can only derive in one way. But it is possible. So you can only do the derivation in one direction. You can't, the derivation is not bidirectional. But it is the case that whenever gamma turnstile A arrow B is derivable, gamma A turnstile B is derivable. When that's true, we say the rule that goes from the one to the other is admissible. And the point is we have to distinguish admissibility from derivability. Again, Gensen knew this. His Hauptsatz, his big theorem, was the admissibility of cut. That even though cut wasn't a rule in his system, every instance of it could be shown to be admissible. So I'll just make that distinction again. We've got the simplified version that can just have atoms, gamma together with A turnstile B, and from that you can derive gamma turnstile A arrow B. But in the other direction, where you cannot derive the simpler thing from the more complex, it's still the case that because the only way you could have gotten to the conditional is from the simpler thing, that whenever the conditional is derivable, so is the simpler thing. As long as there's a unique root that's asymmetric, it will still be the case that whenever you can get farther down, you can get higher up in it. That's derivability. And Gensen had a Finnish student, Kettinen, who looked at Gensen's original connective definitions and saw that you could make them all reversible. That is, so that this admissibility requirement would work in the other direction. And among the things that become reversible in Kettenen's style, his exact version has problems from our point of view, but you can just formulate rules that are bidirectional in the admissibility sense, corresponding to the conditional and negation. And also for the, I think of conditional negation as the genuinely expressive connectives, and think of conjunction and disjunction as merely aggregative. Now, some in our group think this is wrong and that they're all expressive in the same way. But at any rate, there are sort of biconditionals that we want for each of the aggregative connectives as well. And again, in NMMS, we can go both ways. The reason we couldn't use the original Kettner rules is that he was still working in a fully structural environment, and the kind of rules that one wants, if you look at right conjunction, for instance, in the original Gensen system. So we say, really, if gamma implies A and gamma implies B, then gamma implies A and B. Maybe not. Maybe the addition of B interferes with the implication of A if there's a non-monotonicity. So if you look down at the NMMS rule, we throw in, well, it's also got to be the case that gamma implies A together with B, that's okay. Because Kettner thought, well, that can't happen. It's already guaranteed by the first two sequence, but not if there's non-monotonicity in it. So we've had to add these third conditions just in a couple of places, in the left arrow, in the right conjunction, in the left disjunction. But with those, you can elaborate arbitrary base vocabularies. They just have to satisfy CO, the version of reflexivity. Conservatively, define reason relations for them by these rules that will satisfy those conditions on LXness, that the conditional, together with those other things, will let you say of any implication that it holds, and negation, together with the conditional, will let you codify incompatibilities. In that sense, we can prove that NMMS is universally LX for all base vocabularies that satisfy CO. Now, we had been working in single succedent sequent calculi, because we normally think in terms of single consequences. I mean, one of the things about bilateralism was it taught us how to understand the disjunctive conclusions on the right. But what we hadn't realized is that much more expressive power could be gotten in the multi-succedent case. Now let me say, this will come up again. Indeed, if you look at on the last page, number 1 under the 4 examples, one of the things that blew everybody's mind in the mid-30s with Gensen was he laid down one set of connective definitions that yielded both classical logic and intuitionistic logic. It was the same set of connective definitions. The only difference was if you only allowed single conclusions, if you restricted yourself to single conclusions, you got intuitionism. If you allowed multiple conclusions, you got classical logic. And this was a new perspective on the relation between those between those logics that people have been worried about for 30 years anyway. I mean, when you play with it, you see it has to do with whether you can use negation to move stuff across the turnstile and store it on the right while you do other stuff. And it turns out that the difference between intuitionistic negation and classical negation just corresponds to whether you can do that kind of stuff. So we eventually came to see why, given that we already pretty well understood these logics, why this result was possible. But it was Dan Kaplan who saw that in the context of our enterprise, there's a huge difference between these. And we take it that this is the ultimate reason that classical logic is the right logic, or something like that. I mean, NMMS really is, but it is, in this sense, classical logic. If you impose structure on it, you get classical. It just is a version of classical logic. But what Kaplan proved is this very strong representation theorem that for any set of atomic implications, any set of atomic sequence in the base vocabulary, and so those codify, they encode the incompatibilities as well as the implications. Start with any set of that. We can compute a set of logically complex sequence, every one of which holds in any base in which that set of atomic implications holds. So we can compute the set of sequence in the complex language, each of which says those are the basic sequence that hold. Just those. And we can see it saying that regardless of what other ones hold. If you can derive this complex, it's going to be a set of logically complex sentences on the left, a set on the right, but you can derive that only from, if and only if the base has this particular set of implications in it. And we can compute the whole set of those. So we can compute the sentences, each of the sequence, each of which says this set of primitive implications holds. And conversely, can't prove this with entire generality. There's fussiness about whether contraction holds or not. But for the best behaved case, the converse also holds. If you give me an arbitrary set of sequence in the logically complex language, we can say exactly what atomic sentences need to hold for that set of complex sequence to hold. Now, that is a very powerful representation theorem. We have no clue as to how you might show anything like that for a single succedent system. And that's what makes us think the multi-succedent is the way to go here. But this is the point at which we had fully succeeded in our aim to get a single logic that is universally LX. The elaborated from part, yes, you can apply these rules to any base that has CO. It will conservatively extend it, and it will conservatively extend it in a way that now lets you say what the reason relations are of the base. Well, actually, this theorem applies to all the reason relations. You can do the same thing. It's not just the base set. Pick any set, and we can get more complex things that relate to it this way. That's a very definite thing to mean by having the expressive power to say what the reason relations of the base are. Okay, I'll just say one more thing about it. Another expressivist thought applied just to the substructurality is we want to say, look, monotonic implication relations are really useful. You know, if gamma implies A monotonically, we actually sometimes write that persistently. We'll write the turnstile with a little upward arrow, meaning not only does gamma imply A, but no matter what else you throw in with gamma, it still implies A. Those are very useful. And even in a generally non-monotonic vocabulary, there are going to be regions of monotonic implications. For instance, in the extension, in the logical extension of it, all the ones that hold by logic alone will be non-monotonic. But we can introduce definitions that look a lot like these, perfectly good sequent calculus connective definitions that says, okay, if it's the case in a particular base that gamma not only implies A, but persistently implies A, gamma and all its supersets imply A, then we're going to say it's not just that gamma implies A, gamma implies box A, necessarily A. Come what may, give me any more, tell me any more about the world, throw in anything more, and you're still going to get A from gamma. And it turns out we can, in this way, mark the local regions of our reason relations where monotonicity holds. Mark each of those where if the implication holds in the whole upward cone of the premise sets, then we threw in box A as another consequent of it, another conclusion that it implies, which marks this implication as monotonically structured. And the classical structure, the closure structure, is that plus a strong transitivity condition, mixed context cut. Well, there can be regions of the reason relations that are not only monotonic, this implication, but also satisfy that strong transitivity thing. We can mark them with another operator, and now work in. It looks a lot like a modal logic. Well, because I think persistence is what necessity really is. It's telling us, what's true, come what may. You're quantifying over all the premise, all the supersets, rather than all the possible worlds in it. But the second expressive achievement is we can say, look, one of the reasons we can be relaxed about substructural, open structured sets of reason relations is we can clamp our logic onto it and mark the regions where structure does hold, particular structures do hold, and distinguish that from the other ones. We can make it explicit so that you can say this is a persistent implication. This is this set of things is one where you can apply transitivity to them. And this is not a task that non-monotonic logicians have set themselves because they didn't think of starting with their enterprise was not starting with the non-monotonic material thing and doing something with that. It was starting with monotonic logics and trying to get non-monotonic logics from them. So that's an account of basically chapter 3 of the book. And now we better take a break if we're going to get our break. Let's go for 12 minutes. We started, we'll take the 15. Let's come back at 2:50. I wish I could tell. Okay. So I was reporting an accomplishment of the group. We set out wanting a logic that could meet certain conditions and found one, which it already had a name in botanizations of logics downstream from the Kettner things and so on, even though nobody had ever thought it was particularly interesting. I mean, actually, this one with the three, that isn't the standard one, but they're equivalent. But look, the general lesson here, or a general lesson here, is that the more universal structural conditions you put on your logic, the more equivalent, logically equivalent sets of rules they're going to be. So there are a gazillion ways to specify the theorems and the consequence relation of classical logic. Classical logic's compact if you specify the theorems. You have specified the consequence relation for classical logic. It's not true of all logics. But if you relax major structural conditions, monotonicity, transitivity, formulations that are equivalent in the presence of those strong structural conditions come apart. They all generate different logics. And now, instead of having a gazillion different ways of specifying classical logic, that is, the reason relations among sentences in a logically extended language that hold just in virtue of the connective rules, now you have a gazillion different logics. There are just way more logics in substructural circumstances than there are in structural circumstances. And while within the structural boundaries, Kettner found a set of rules that were equivalent to Genson's rules, but were reversible, which has all kinds of good effects. Well, that's the thing that Kaplan exploits in getting his representation theorem. But if you go substructural, the original Kettner rules don't specify classical logic anymore. They specify a different logic. So there's a general thing one can do in these formal areas, which is relax some structural constraint and look at all the distinctions that emerge and study the relations among the distinguished items. That's what we found ourselves doing. So that things that looked very familiar, we said, well, that's just classical logic. Well, is it in a non-monotonic setting? What can you get from it? And some of them don't behave well. There's problems with them if you apply them to substructural. Mostly they're not conservative because the structural thing closes the base under monotonicity, say. So if I have the ordinary conjunction rules, then they're going to let me turn gamma implies A into gamma together with B implies A. At any rate, our undertaking emphasizes just how much there is to explore just of formulations of classical logic once one relaxes structural conditions. And logical expressivism tells us, and what we care about is the difference in their expressive power. And that's the dimension along which we claim NMMS is an unrivaled champion at so far. Okay. Now, so far, basically everything I've said about logic and most of the stuff I've said about reason relations is all from the point of view that we have adopted in pursuing this project, which is at at a considerable distance from what most other logicians and philosophers of logic are doing. For instance, I've emphasized what we wanted was not a non-monotonic logic. We wanted a logic to codify non-monotonic consequence relations. And it turns out that can be a monotonic logic. At least the purely logical portion of NMMS is just classical logic, and that's monotonic. The consequence relation of almost every logically extended language will be non-monotonic. But the purely logical part of it is monotonic. There's a big difference in those enterprises trying to come up with a non-monotonic logic and trying to come up with a logic that codifies non-monotonic consequence relations. It's the second one that we're undertaking. But if you ask who else has tried to do that, nobody, because you have to be philosophically motivated by the expressivist enterprise in order to do that. So, fine. Logic is littered with people who are engaging in logical enterprises that are at some remove from what everybody else is doing. And they go off and develop their systems. Is this just like that? What you'd like to know is how this bears on other ways of thinking about things. And what we'll see is, well, we can give a sound and complete semantics for this logic in implication space semantics, and by doing that we can show things about truth maker semantics that are had not been remarked on or demonstrated there. I want to close today with another example that will require me to do a little bit of logic that isn't immediately relevant to what we're doing, just so that we can apply. So, there's a contrast between logics that are looking at preserving truth or truth value and logics that preserve the goodness of consequence. Salva veritate, salva consequentia. Now, standard truth table logics, you're preserving truth. That's what the good implications are. I'll just talk about implication. And there's a generalization of that to multi-valued logic. We've got multiple truth values. We're still thinking in terms of truth values, so it's still a classically semantic sort of picture, but we allow a third truth value. And we say, well, one, which is truth, that still defines consequence. We still, the good implications are the ones that if all the premises get that value true, then some of the conclusions do too in the multi-accident case. Well, what difference does it make that there's three values rather than two if it's truth preservation that we use to define consequence? What difference does that make? We say the value that's preserved by good consequences is the designated value. So one is designated, half and zero are not. What difference does the difference between half and zero make? Well, it only makes a difference to the designatedness of some compounds that it occurs in. The difference between multi-values that are undesignated, they can make different contributions. Substituting one for the other can turn a designated compound into one that isn't. Okay, well, here's the standard on page 3 of the handout, is the standard Truth tables, well, for multi-values, just it's matrices, but remember, it's still truth values we're thinking of here. The truth value matrix that is strong cleaning. And I think this is generally familiar. Well, one of the things that happened in the late 70s, I guess Graham Priest's book, I think, is 79, is Priest said, what if we mess with the structure of this? What if we treat a half as designated also, but keep the same connective definitions? In some sense, we mean the same thing by the connectives. They have the same table, but we change the surround by treating the intermediate value as also designated. Well, you get a different logic. The logic you get, strong Kleene, with just one designated value is K3. That's Kripke's logic. Using that third value, thinking of that as neither true nor false, gives us a status that the semantic paradoxes can have. The liar paradox can be given that intermediate value. It's neither true nor false, and we're not forced to apply excluded middle to it, because excluded middle only gets the intermediate value, neither true nor false, too. So we're not forced to either choose and say the liar sentence is true, from which we can prove that it's false, or that it's false, from which we can prove that it's true. We say it's neither true nor false by allowing truth value gaps into our system. And surprisingly, Priest showed that if you just change the definition of consequence, allow 1/2 in there, in effect, you're treating the intermediate value as both true and false. You don't get non-contradiction as simply false. It ends up both true and false if the thing you're applying it to, A and not A, if A gets the intermediate value, then so does that instance of non-contradiction. So they're not true, but you can reason with them. You don't have an explosion for them. Now so LP, the logic of paradox, is a logic of truth value gluts, where things can be both true and false, and K3 is a logic of gaps. And it was surprising to people that you could flip that, add gaps just by only treating one of the values as designated, and get gluts instead by treating the other, by treating a second one as designated. That just that difference should make the difference between a gappy logic and a glutty logic. Both of them were motivated by wanting a status for these semantically paradoxical statements. And so there was a lively and productive debate in connection with the semantic paradoxes and logic about these two logics. So that's the sort of phenomenon that I want to address. And now, here's how it looks to us. In a fully structural context, if you have an implication A turnstile B, it follows from that, you can prove from that you can substitute A for B as a premise in any good consequence, in any sequent, salva consequentiae. If A implies B, then if you've got B implies C, you can substitute A for B, and if B implies C was good, A implies C will be good. You cut on the conclusion. A is inferentially stronger than B, so anything that B implies, since A implies B, A is going to imply B. If you've got transitivity, you have that. And it's also true, follows from the goodness of A turnstile B, that you can substitute B everywhere for A as a conclusion, salva consequentiae. That is, if A implies B, and you can prove A, then you can prove B, because you can get from A to B. So on the right-hand side, you can substitute the weaker thing for the stronger thing, and on the premise side, you can substitute the stronger thing for the weaker thing, thinking of the implication as telling you what's weaker and stronger, that the premise is stronger than the conclusion. That is, in the presence of transitivity of cut, these two meta-inferential generalizations follow from the goodness of any implication. There's a series of premissory substitutions that you can make, but a whole bunch of them. Anywhere the conclusion appears as a premise, you can substitute the premise for it, salva consequentiae. And similarly, on the conclusory side. So think about, the sequent calculus is about meta-inferences, because it's objects, sequence, what follows are implications, and we're talking about relations of implications. So these are meta-inferential reason relations. And what we see is transitivity ensures that if there's an implication across the turnstile internally, then these two external meta-inferential patterns also apply. And we can say that A has B as a premissory consequence, in meaning that you can always substitute A for B as a premise, and that that A is a conclusory consequence of B, in that you can always substitute B for A as a consequence, salva consequentiae. But if you're in a substructural setting, which we are when we're thinking about applying a logic to a base, which may not be fully structural, that's not the setting that Kripke and Priest were thinking about K3 and LP in. But if we do ask that question, now there's three separate things. There's whether the sequent A turnstile B is a good one, and there's the question whether you can always substitute A for B as a premise, and there's the question whether you can always substitute B for A as a conclusion, and those are independent questions now, in general. So we can ask questions, so it can happen, in particular, that you can substitute A for B everywhere as a premise, salva consequentiae, but you can't substitute B for A everywhere as a conclusion, salva consequentiae, or vice versa. These are just three independent notions. So as I say, this is sort of a question, an observation people hadn't made before, that things, if you're just thinking salva veritate, these are equivalent systems. The premissory role inclusion, conclusory role inclusion, and just implication, those all coincide in a structurally transitive circumstance. But they don't. They come apart in a substructural context. And here is the astonishing discovery, again, this is Dan Kaplan. If anywhere you look at the premissory role inclusions, those are the reason relations that are captured by K3. And if you look at the conclusory role inclusions, those are captured by LP. That is, you can define K3 as the logic of premissory role inclusions, and LP as the logic of conclusory role inclusions. And they're different precisely because you are going substructural, in that you've got some sentences that take this intermediate value, and that has structural consequences for them. And I want to draw some conclusions from this as moving from looking at what substitutions are good salva veritate, preserve designatedness, and looking at which ones are good salva consequentiae, never turn a good implication into one that isn't. And if we go substructural, we can specify subconsequentiae, salva consequentiae, premissory role inclusions, and conclusory role inclusions. And if you want to compute the premissory role inclusions of logically complex sentences under the Strong-Kleene definitions, the premissory role inclusions are just those of K3, and the conclusory ones are just those of LP. Now that, I claim, is a genuine insight, a discovery about this rather well-studied pair of logics, which are duals of each other in many ways. Anything that's a tautology in LP, the contrapositive of it is a tautology in K3 and vice versa, for instance. But this means, I think, that there's a question. We think the real phenomenon is these trilogics just capture either premissory role inclusions or conclusory role inclusions. That's what they really do. If we're thinking about them in terms of reason relations, it's those meta-inferences, which, remember, Gensen showed us how to define the meanings of connectives and so of sentences based on the meta-inferences that implications involving them stand in. Well, we're doing that same thing here, and we're saying, well, it's the premissory and the conclusory, and if what you care about is reason relations, those are very natural meta-inferential things to care about. They're not interesting except in substructural cases, and again, that's why they're not much studied. But here's a question for you. If that's the real phenomenon, why should that show up semantically as the distinction between a logic of gaps and a logic of gluts. What is the connection between premissory role inclusions and gaps and conclusory role inclusions and gluts? Answering that question is going to tell us something about the difference between the semantic framework, where you're computing the truth value, the multi-value of complex sentences from that of simple sentences using these matrices, and then using preservation of designatedness to define reason relations. That's a semantic approach. Why do these two semantic approaches, the K3 and the LP, which are the logic of gluts and of gaps, it was puzzling enough why that should correspond to counting both 1.5 as designated as opposed to just treating one as designated. But if we think about the half as interpreted as either neither or both, and think about the role of instances of excluded middle and instances of non-contradiction, we can sort of see it on the purely semantic side. But what's the connection to premises and conclusion, premissory role inclusions and conclusory role inclusions? Now, Ulf gives the sort of full-blown answer to this at pages 244 and 245 in the book. And I mean, what he says is right, though I felt, and to some extent still feel, there's a deeper, snappier story waiting to be told. But here is the best I can do for it. Let's just think about K3. A corresponding story will work for the other side as well. Suppose A is one of the cases where transitivity fails. A is one of the sentences that you can't move from from the right side of the turnstile and the left side of the turnstile. You can't just cut and say, oh, the occurrence of it on one side is the same as the occurrence on the other. A is one of those uncuttable sentences. So there are some, lots of them are cuttable, it's mostly transitive, but there's some that are not. That's the setting that led to the interest in these trilogics to begin with, because they want the paradoxical sentences to be uncuttable on. That's how you avoid deriving everything from them. If A is uncuttable, then an instance, A or not A, on the left as a premise becomes uncuttable. And that means that you're treating it as something that you don't need to, that you are entitled not to accept, which is sort of implicitly, so for instance, you can't cut on it. So from the fact that gamma together with A or not A, B follows, you can't just say, oh, so gamma implies B. That would be sort of taking all the instances of excluded middle for granted. That's what it is to say you can substitute the empty set for excluded middle in premissory inclusions. Sorry, it's the other way around. That's saying, right, the move you can't make is from the the presence of that instance to the absence of it. And that implies a certain attitude towards excluded middle as a premise, that it's not a free premise, one you can just put in or take out as you can in the classical setting, because it's guaranteed to be true or to be acceptable. So I think that, if you think about the status of excluded middle and for on the left for K3 and of instances of non-contradiction on the right for LP, you actually can see why, if you're going to understand consequence the way they do, failures of transitivity are going to show up as gaps on the left and gluts on the right. At any rate, I've gone through all this, even though we don't really care about the trilogics. Well, we care about them to the extent that they're the logic of premissory role inclusions and the logic of conclusory role inclusions, and it's good to know what those are, recognize these other things. But I mention it because it's an example of where you can take our approach to well-worked over areas and really learn something new from them. And I guess the last thing I want to say is we've seen two complicated examples of a phenomenon in what I call distinctions with relations emerging from the relaxation of structure. So the well-known one, maybe this is an instance of the same thing, but I think it is. Gensen's showing if you start off with multi-succedent sequent calculus and these rules, you get classical logic. But if you if you impose the structural requirement that, all right, I want to go the other way. So start with the single succedent, you get intuitionistic logic, that's fine, but you have this structural restriction. You can only put one thing on the right. Put a whole set on the left, but only one thing on the right. If you relax that, allow sets on both sides. Just that relaxation of the structural constraint gives you classical logic instead. And now we can ask about the relation between classical and intuitionistic logic and learn about it because you make that distinction. And we showed, remember, that with respect to our logic, if you take logics that are equivalent under full closure structure, like NMMS and LK, Gensen's classical logic, it's K because classical is a K in German, those are equivalent specifications of classical logic under closure structure, but if you relax that structure, they define different logics. They define different sets of reason relations over the sentences of a logically extended language. There's a sense in which there's still both classical logic, the purely logical part of them, of each of those logically extended vocabularies is the same, but the expressive power of them is very different. So by relaxing structure, distinctions appear that didn't appear before, and we learn things. So I see a sort of progression from the intuitionism and classical logic with Gensen to this result about MMS and LK. Again, just for the bit about the trilogics at the end, surprising discovery, wonderful move of Graham. to use the Strong-Kleene connective definition tables, but change what was designated, so change the notion of consequence, and get quite a different logic that's related to the other one in fascinating ways. So changing that structural item about what counts as designated had this big effect. And we see that if you move from thinking about implication salva veritate, preserving a designated value, and think about them salva consequentiae, if you relax particularly the transitivity structure, then you get two different, things you could mean by implication. You could mean that A implies B, just in case you can always substitute A for B as a premise, salva consequentiae, or you could mean that you can always substitute B for A as a conclusion, salva consequentiae, and those are two different notions, each of them interesting. Well, one of them gives you K3 and the other gives you LP, but you couldn't see that if you were just looking in a transitive environment. So it seems to me there's a general lesson to be learned here, at least a general phenomenon that these are instances of. And again, the two that are the old ones are the Gensen classical and intuitionistic logic, and Priest connecting K3 and LP as having the same connective definitions but different consequence definitions. Those are well known and well studied, but the new ones, relaxing the structural conditions on the reason relations of your base vocabularies, so different logics come apart, and some of them are more expressive than others, and moving to looking at which substitutions preserve the goodness of consequences, which substitutions on the premissory and conclusory side. Again, we get two new things. Gee, it's LP and K3 once again. So I started off by asking if the logicists were wrong about the reason question, about the relation between logic and reasons. If it isn't the case that good reason just means logically good reason, and it's our business to find out the underlying language that those logical relations are in. If that's wrong and we're expressivists, what's our ideal logic? What's the non plus ultra? It would be one that was LX, universally LX, that for any base vocabulary, you could apply this logic to it, extend it conservatively in a way that results in your being able to say what the reason relations of the base are. Now, we restrict this to bases in which CO holds. It's not that anything nasty happens if you apply it to bases that CO doesn't hold in. It's just nothing interesting comes out the other end. You need some structure, it turns out, and that's minimal. So for the others, you can logically elaborate them. It's just, it won't be super classical anymore. What will it look like? I don't know. We haven't really looked into it. But it turns out that expressive ideal is a satisfiable ideal. It is possible to get that logic, and NMMS is provably one of them. So I'll start off. Next time, I want to introduce the implication space semantics from Chapter 5. Had us look at that because the premissory and conclusory role inclusions, that stuff is in Chapter 5 already. So this will be reflected on the website when I get around to reflecting it on the website. But we'll start off worrying about this new kind of semantics that Dan Kaplan adapted from the semantics for linear logic. And I'll just say, because I'm not going to go through the argument in the book, that it's easy to show NMMS, to get a sound and complete completeness proof for NMMS in that new semantics, and that gives us a road between this semantics and truth maker semantics. So, okay.